והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידה. והיא שעמדה לאבותינו, והיא שעמדה לאבותינו אלנו, שלא אחד בלבד עומד עלינו לכלותנו, בגדנו לכלותנו, והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם, והקדוש ברוך הוא מצילנו מידם.
והיא שעמדה. The lyrics of that song are taken from the Passover Haggadah, and it's a very famous line. In every generation they rise up to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed be He, delivers us from their midst. I let it play a little extra, first because I had a technical difficulty. I had trouble getting the stream going today. But then once it was going, I didn't want to cut it off. I love the song. And I received it today as a WhatsApp viral video, and I don't know who the singers are. It looks like three Israeli guys. It's some kind of a live event. If you recognize that version of the song and who is singing, please put it in the comments so that I can credit those guys. Just beautiful. Let's light up the darkness. All right, lots to cover today. Who is with us as we get it going? Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov. Tonight not only begins Shabbos, but it's the seventh day of Passover, which is a full-fledged festival. And of particular importance, what happened on the seventh day after the Exodus? This was the day that we crossed the Red Sea, often called the Red Sea, but it's not the Red Sea, it was the Sea of Reeds. And on that moment, right, as the Torah relates, that we crossed through on dry land with the water as a wall on each side. It wasn't just, miraculous in the sense that, the water was off to the side and we were able to walk dry shod through the Sea of Reeds. It was a moment of extreme, divine presence. It was a mystical moment. And our sages say that, any Joe Schmo who happened to be part of the 2 million people crossing the sea that day experienced a higher level of prophecy than all the prophets which followed. It was an extreme moment of heaven and earth coming together in that, that passage, that beautiful passage through the sea. And that happened on this day in his shared earlier today with the people on my WhatsApp list, and I put it on the page here on Facebook as well. We're going to make that WhatsApp group like a publicly accessible WhatsApp group with a link to join it. I just haven't had a moment to figure out how to do that yet. But at any rate, I send out a Friday message to my friends on WhatsApp, and today's message, this beautiful, very compact, wonderful quote from a sage of the Talmud, who said one who adds to the truth subtracts from it. Right? If you embellish the truth, you actually subtract from the truth. And his proof text is what's so fascinating. He points back to Genesis, and God said to Adam, before Eve was created, after God placed Adam in the Garden of Eden, said, you may eat of all these trees, but of this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, do not eat of it, for on the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. Then he creates Eve, and the serpent comes along, and Eve has a conversation with the serpent, and Eve reports to the serpent that God said to us, do not eat the fruit of this tree, nor touch it. For if you do, you shall surely die. So she added, don't touch it. God never said don't touch it. Now you could say, well, this was a fence around the Torah, the fence around the tree, as it were. We don't want to eat it, so we're not even going to touch it. That's something the sages might say. But as we've seen, whenever the sages make a decree to prevent us from coming to violate a commandment from God, the sages make it very clear which part of the commandment came from God and which came from the sages themselves. Eve credited God with saying that. Now, maybe she embellished the truth, or maybe Adam embellished the truth when he told to Eve what the commandment was. Either way, somebody added to the truth, and when you add to the truth with an untruth, you subtract from the truth, as Hizkiah ben Chia says. And of course, that story did not end well. So may we be blessed to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Amen. All right, who's with us as we get it going? Erev Shabbos, Erev Yom Tov. James says Shabbat Shalom. Yehudit in South Carolina. Tamoy says hi. Guy in Ohio. Sean in Oregon. Rochelle in Modesto. Randy in Florida. Sharon in New Jersey. Ryan in Jacksonville. Leona says hello. PK in Colorado. Gwen, can you recommend a good prayer book for me to order for daily meals, etc.? I have a bunch of prayer books, and I use the different ones at different times. So it really depends what you're looking for. What I recommend most is getting your hands on one of these. Go to a Jewish bookstore and see which one speaks to you more. I mean, I'm very fond of the Koran. But I also love the Art Scroll, and I probably use it more than the Koran, and I love the Chabad prayer book, Tehillas Hashem. It really depends on what you're looking for. The Art Scroll has the interlineal translation, where every word in Hebrew has the English translation under it. I'm not always so, when I daven from that, when I pray from that prayer book, I sometimes get distracted by that, running translation right there. But on the other hand, it helps me so much to, as I want to develop my skill to pray in Hebrew and know what I'm saying and really know what I'm saying. The Art Scroll Interlineal is great for that. It really depends what you're looking for. That's all I can say. So Tom says Shabbat from Pennsylvania. Leona loves the shirt. How can I get one? I'm sure Nina's going to put that link in the comments, but it's in our store, shop.accidentaltalmudist.org. Where am I? PK loves that music. John is with us from Lewiston, Maine, and in Merced. Tom likes the Art Scroll Sitter. Rochelle, so after a year plus, why do you ring the bell? What do you mean? We ring the bell every day. Wake up! The bell is our wake-up call. So the bell is definitely an everyday thing. And what I've asked myself is, why do you have two symbols? It's like two things. 1 + 1, Nina and I always say, as a screenwriting principle, 1 + 1 = 1/2. If you give a character two motivations for doing something, it's weaker than if they have one motivation. So why should I have two symbols to symbolize AT daily? But it just kind of organically happened. I like the bell, like let's wake up, let's get to work. But the wisdom candle burns throughout the show. Right? And the wisdom candle has come to be our little logo. That actually, I don't think, that wasn't there before we were doing AT Daily. Now it's part of the Accidental Talmudist logo. And if you look at all the products in the AT store, they have the wisdom candle with its rays of light, incorporated into the shirt somewhere. So that's pretty much the AT logo now. So that's the way it happened. Steven says, Shabbat Shalom. My 60th birthday is tomorrow. Happy birthday, young man. 60, what a great age. I'm a few years away, but not many. But what I told myself when I turned 50 is, 50, traumatic. But then when you turn 51, you realize, I'm in my very early 50s. Okay. PK says, an amazing miracle that the sea was parted and kept parted until all crossed over. Amen. That's absolutely right. Dorothy says, Shabbat Shalom. Donna says, Shalom. Sharon says that Rabbi Bradley Artson, a friend of mine, uses the same text about the dangers of the fence around the Torah when they become excessive. Very good. Nancy's in St. Louis. Charlene wishing us peace. Sam Richardson, Moadim L'Simcha from Central Virginia. Moadim L'Simcha to you, Sam. That's a greeting that we use during the intermediate days of the holiday, the intermediate days of Passover, the intermediate days of Sukkot. I get Hastwan in Indianapolis. Sam loves the introduction. I should have mentioned that. In the Koren Siddur, you have an introduction to the prayer book by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that is phenomenal. I recommend you have all these sidders in your house. Then decide which one you really want to use every day, if it's affordable. But if possible, it is good to have different prayer books because at different times you need a different prayer book. That's what I say. Baruch loves the art scroll. Jenny saying Shabbat Shalom from the United Kingdom. Gwen says the Jewish bookstore is here around 3 to 4 hours a day. Well, you know what you might do? Order them from Amazon, and if it's the wrong book, you can always return it. That way you can sample the book and see if it speaks to you. Mark says Shabbat Shalom. Rochelle says, thank you. I've been wanting to ask, I guess, about the bell. And says you can find Jewish books on Amazon. All right, the bell. We got to get started with this class. I apologize if I didn't call somebody's name. Over there on the YouTube side, Lindsay in Cincy, Lynn in Texas, Gigi in British Columbia, Marjorie in Georgia, and Star Seema Web Design says nice branding. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Great to have you with us. Okay. Where are we holding? This is Daf Yud Aleph, page 11, here in Tractate Shekalim, the 5th volume of the Talmud. It only has 22 pages, so do the math. We are halfway through and we complete today's Daf. We are in chapter 4. Generally, what we're talking about here is the finances of the temple, but it gives us a beautiful insight into how the temple was run and how the pilgrims came and how they interacted with the priests. Sort of the business of the temple is fascinating. And today, as we'll see, when people did business with the temple, they lost. They always lost, and that was a kindness to them. They only lost by a fraction, by a tiny, tiny little bit. But the temple would always make sure that whenever there was a matter of doubt, any like they would round off, like 1 penny extra would have to go to the temple. And that protects you from mistakenly or accidentally coming to misappropriate property of the temple, which is a transgression. That's why the house of God always wins, as it were. And today we'll see a few different mechanisms that they put in place to make sure that people didn't accidentally misappropriate the sacred to their own use. Okay, so let's keep going. We are discussing the second Mishnah, and we're going to complete that and start the third Mishnah here in chapter 4. So we learned in the Mishnah that according to Abba Shaul, the high priests would pay for the ramp of the Red Heifer from their own funds. Now the thinking here being that when there were 9 heifers in Jewish history. They were pure red heifers, pure red cows. That were identified at a young age, kept from doing any kind of work. And when they were the right age, they were slaughtered outside the temple. They were burned. Their ashes were then collected and kept in a special treasured place where they would be mixed, some of those ashes, with water in a certain way. And then those would become the waters of purification as specified in the Torah. So when they had these, big event in Jewish history, there were only 9 of them while the temples stood, and the Mishkan, the Torah gave this commandment at the time of the tabernacle in the desert. So over those 1,200 years between receiving the Torah and the destruction of the second temple, there were only 9 red heifers in all that time, in 1,200 years, where they did this ceremony. Now, they built a bridge from the Temple Mount to the place on the Mount of Olives where they slaughtered and burned the heifer. And the reason of this bridge, and it has a very particular kind of construction, is so that the priest who walks the heifer there and back, or walks the heifer there and then carries back the ashes, must not come into contact with any sources of impurity, including an unknown, unmarked grave that might have been there in that valley next to the Temple Mount. And to protect them from that, they built this special bridge, and it's built in a certain way so that there would always be an interposition between you and any possible unmarked grave below it. Okay, now since this bridge was to keep it from becoming impure, it wasn't really an essential part of the service. It was something that the rabbis decreed should be done. And so they had a debate on whether or not temple funds could be used for that. The rabbis said yes, but Abba Shaul said no, the priests should pay for it themselves. So that's where we are. Rabbi Hanina said about this issue, there was great haughtiness among the high priests, as they would spend more than 60 talents of gold on it. A fortune. Now we start to see why Abba Shaul had this strange opinion. Obviously, if we want to keep that cow from coming into contact with any source of impurity, that benefits the whole nation and anyone who might need to use those waters of purification, after they themselves became tameh, ritually impure, by touching a corpse, like doing the good deed of burying a dead body that didn't have somebody else to bury it. Then you become impure. Before you can re-enter the temple, you have to go through a purification process that requires that water with the ashes of the red heifer. So it's definitely something that the community should pay for. Why wouldn't they? Why would Abba Shaul have this opinion? Now we get a little bit of insight into that. Rabbi Hanina is telling us that the priests, actually, they had that bridge. It was still there from the last time that a heifer was taken out. But the high priest in that moment, in that year, when the new heifer was needed and was brought, would dismantle the old bridge and build their own. And not only did they build a new bridge, they went way beyond the needs of the bridge and made it kind of grand and made a real spectacle of this ceremony. As you could imagine. There are coronations of kings of England more often than 9 times in 1,200 years. Sure, they should make a big deal. Now, Rabbi Hanina interprets these grand bridges and the spectacle of this ceremony as being haughty, as the haughtiness of the high priest at the time that one of these ceremonies was conducted. This expenditure was unnecessary as the previous ramp of the heifer was still standing, but not one of the high priests would take out his heifer on his fellow's ramp. Rather, he would demolish it and build a new one from his own funds, says Rabbi Hanina. Rabbi Ula strongly objects to this assertion of Rabbi Hanina, who characterized the high priests as haughty. Rabbi Ula says, and he said this in the presence of Rabbi Mana, wasn't it taught in a baraisa that Shimon HaTzadik performed the rites of 2 red heifers in his time as high priest? He was a high priest for a very long time. And the ramp on which he took out this one, he did not use again to take out the other one. Is it possible for you to say Shimon HaTzadik was haughty? What then is the reason that he constructed a new ramp? Now, before I finish this, who was Shimon HaTzadik? He's actually well, let me read it to you. Shimon HaTzadik, or Shimon the Righteous, is the first of the sages mentioned in the chain of tradition in Tractate Avos, right? In Pirkei Avos, the chapters of the fathers, which opens by saying that Moses received the Torah from God at Mount Sinai, and he passed it to Joshua to the elders to the judges to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, and the last of these, I think, was Shimon HaTzadik, right? So he's the first he's a high priest, but he's also the first of the sages who are mentioned. I mean, this guy, his humility, his holiness was on another level. We're going to call him haughty. That's what Rabbi Ula is saying. You're going to call Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, you're going to call him haughty? He is described as one of the remnants of the Great Assembly. According to Josephus, his full name was Shimon ben Hunya ben Yadua. Based upon the few facts mentioned about him, it seems that he was the high priest at the beginning of the rule of the Greeks in Eretz Yisrael. So he was the high priest at the time that Alexander the Great conquered all this land in the area, including the Holy Land of Israel. And it was him, Shimon HaTzadik, the high priest, who greeted Alexander of Macedon, Alexander the Great, upon his conquering of the land. Some of his activities are recorded in Josephus's Antiquities, his book Antiquities, and some of his praises are mentioned in the book of Ben Sira, the author of which apparently knew him personally. This book also contains a description of Shimon HaTzadik as he left the sanctuary on Yom Kippur, which later served as the inspiration for the liturgical hymn recited on Yom Kippur called Appearance of the Priest. On Yom Kippur, if you read the full service, which if you do the whole service, it takes many hours. You're in shul many hours on Yom Kippur. And, what can I say? When I grew up, I went to a more liberal shul where, I sat there through the service, but they never got into the rites of the high priest on Yom Kippur. In any Orthodox service, you certainly do. And I highly recommend you read it because it's beautiful. It's so beautiful. And it just describes the sort of choreography, moment by moment, of what the high priest did on Yom Kippur. And the language, in a good translation, imbues every movement of the high priest on that day as a beautiful and mystical and holy act, which is what it was. I mean, he was bringing an atonement on behalf of the whole nation. He prepared for it for months. He prepared for it specifically to be physically ready that day for a week, and he was being educated, and then the sages were reading to him, passages from the Torah and from the prophets. And I mean, he was just so prepared, and everything he did that day, had a gravity and a beauty that is really captured. And all of that comes from this description that captured Shimon HaTzadik serving in the temple. So this is no person to be called haughty. So the question is, if he's not haughty and he's utterly righteous, he's Shimon the Righteous, why? And in his lifetime, 2 red heifers were brought. So why did he feel the need to rebuild the bridge for bringing the heifer across from the Mount of Olives to the Temple Mount when the previous bridge was still standing? Why did he rebuild it? That's the question. Let's get the answer. What then is the reason that he constructed a new ramp? It is due to a higher standard that was established with regard to the ceremony of the red heifer. It is due to a higher level of honor according to the ceremony of the red heifer. So, it's like he was the first of the sages. So this was the beginning of that process conducted not so much by the priests as by the sages to understand exactly what the law says. And they weren't adding to the law. They would never, add something and call it a Torah commandment when it was a rabbinic decree. But they issued decrees that would protect us and protect, in this case, the high priest from coming into any kind of contact with impurity. And as they learned more about the issues from that first bridge and how they should deal with it, they realized they needed a newer bridge. That's what happened. And it was taught in a baraisa that projections and walls would extend from the ramp from here and from there, i.e. on either side, in order that the priests would not peek out over the edge while they're walking the heifer out or carrying the ashes back, and thereby become ritually impure when they lean their bodies over a possible grave that could be in the ground without people even knowing about it. We continue. We learn in the Mishnah that according to Rabbi Yishmael, the leftover remains of the chamber were used to purchase wine, oil, and fine flour. These items were sold to individuals who needed them for their private offerings, and the proceeds went to the temple treasury. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, one may not generate profit by selling consecrated property or by using funds set aside for the poor. And the Gemara explains that Rabbi Akiva prohibited doing business with consecrated funds only when there was a risk of loss. However, if the seller of the wine, oil, or fine flour wanted to agree that any loss from the subsequent sale of these items would be his, while any profit gain would go to the temple treasury of consecrated property, it is permitted. In other words, if a vendor who provided the temple with flour or with wine or with any of the items that were used in the offerings, including the libations, oil, wine, and fine flour that accompanied other offerings. So if a vendor was providing these to the temple, and he wanted to, and maybe the routine of this vendor and the temple was to make a contract, that you are going to provide X number of liters of oil or of wine at certain times of the year. And they would agree on a price at the beginning of the year, right? So the temple's, let's say, just today's money, the temple is going to pay you, $10 per liter. Okay, so if the price goes up, so now it goes up to $15 a liter. Well, it makes perfect sense. The temple and the vendor agreed to a contract that was going to be $10 a liter. The price went up. Okay, well, the vendor made a contract. He's not going to profit from the fact that the market rate went up. He agreed to sell liters to the temple at $10 a liter, and that will be the price. That makes sense. Nothing surprising about that. When you make a contract with anybody, what you're taking away is the risk of fluctuations. Even though you might lose by it, at least you know you're going to make a sale. However, if the price went down, right? So if the price actually dropped, the market price dropped to $5 a liter, and the temple had agreed to pay $10 a liter, now when they go buy the next liter, they only pay $5. Right? So the contract is only going to help the temple. It's not going to help the vendor. And so, maybe they would just agree, well, I'll sell to you at the market rate. But at any rate, any kind of a contract that was made with the temple, you had to agree in advance that if there was some kind of a fluctuation, you would absorb the loss. If there was some kind of a profit, the temple would share in that profit. And this was the same principle that was used for the estate of orphans. Right, so if somebody died and left orphans, and there was some money in the estate, and the orphans were too young to manage their own estate, so then the court would find somebody who would agree to do the following. They would be responsible for the estate of the orphans. And if they wanted to invest the money of that estate, because, you should invest in land or stock or something so that that money has a chance to grow over time. But the orphans can't bear any risk. So a person is agreeing like this: I'm going to invest the money of the orphans. If it's a good investment and the profits go up, okay, then the orphans and I will share the profit. But if it's a bad investment and the value of the principal goes down, then I, as the one responsible for the estate of the orphans, will make up the loss out of my own pocket. Now, I don't know how that, relates to court-appointed trustees in modern secular law. I have a law degree, but I don't know the law on this issue. However, there's something beautiful and holy about this, right? It's like in matters pertaining to holiness, right? Whether it's like your obligations to the Lord or your obligations to these orphans, which are, modulated by the law of holiness, then you're going to assume that risk, and it's going to make sure that the trustees are going to be very careful with those investments, as they should be, because the orphans are defenseless. So it's a different rationale in terms of the orphans. They need to be taken care of because they can't take care of themselves. And with regard to the temple, it's just a Torah prohibition on appropriating consecrated property to yourself. And if you somehow gain in a business transaction with the temple, then it's like you took consecrated property that belonged to the temple and made it your own. And it just was not allowed. We skip forward a little bit. Actually, I just explained that, so I don't think it needs to be explained again. So I'm going to go forward to the third Mishnah here in chapter 4. New Mishnah. This has to do with the incense that was burned on a daily basis in the temple. And there was a special incense, that extra incense that was burned on Yom Kippur by the high priest. The leftover incense from 1 year could not be used the following year, as it had been purchased with the shekels collected for the previous year. So there was incense burned every day, and there would always be some leftover incense at the end of the year. They would overproduce so that there would never be a shortage. But they had this law that, as we've seen, there's a yearly collection of the silver half shekels, and that's for the coming year to do the offerings of the coming year. Meaning animal offerings and the incense offering have to be purchased with the funds of that year. So the incense that was purchased with the funds of the previous year could not be brought on the incense altar in the following year. Now, that means, so the incense is disqualified because its year has passed. Are you going to throw away that incense? Very problematic. First of all, it's consecrated. Second of all, it's very expensive, very, very, high-end incense, as it were, that was ground, that was mixed and ground by two families that had this that had a special relationship with the temple. They had the knowledge of how to make the incense, passed down through the generations. And it's very, very special stuff. You don't just throw it away because it's disqualified. So what did they do with it? That's the question. So what would be done with it in order to make it usable? Since its time has passed, it's now disqualified because it was purchased with last year's funds. So was there something they could do to make it usable this year? And the temple treasurers would set aside an amount of it equal to the value of the wages of the artisans who worked in the temple, and actually the artisans who make the incense. And they would then deconsecrate that incense by transferring its sanctity to the money owed to the artisans, right? So these artisans need to be paid for work that they're doing for the temple. So there's money set aside for the artisans. Now they take that money, which is about to be paid to the artisans, and instead of paying it to the artisans, they exchange it for this incense that was made with from the previous year. So now they've deconsecrated the money because they use it to pay for this incense. And then they give the incense to the workers as their wage, which makes sense for the workers who make incense. And then they purchase it back from them with this year's shekels. That's the point of this whole sort of rigmarole, is to go through an exchange process that deconsecrates the money, deconsecrates the previous incense purchase with the previous money, and then we purchase it back with funds from this year's collection. And that renders that incense, which is perfectly good in itself, renders it usable. And so as we see, in matters of holiness, it's not practical. We're not looking for practicality here. We're looking for an elevated spirituality, an elevated holiness that is consistent with the commands of the Torah. And sometimes they would have to create these kinds of systems of exchange in order to remain consistent with the law. So I explained that. And finally, they would return and buy back the incense from the artisans with funds from the new collection of shekels. If the new funds come on time, i.e. by the beginning of the Hebrew month of Nisan, the month we're in now, they purchase the incense with funds from the new collection of shekels. And if not, they may still purchase it from the old collection and it is valid. That is strange to me. But I guess they went through this process and made it available to be purchased with new shekels. And the only reason that they don't have the new shekels available is because they haven't come in yet. In that case, they can use the old shekels, but now the old shekels are standing in for the new shekels, and that's why this becomes possible. That's the Mishnah. Here's the Gemara. We learned in the Mishnah that the leftover incense was deconsecrated with money that the temple treasury owed the artisans. And the Gemara asks, isn't it found that this process involves consecrated property being deconsecrated with other consecrated property? The artisans were paid with money from the temple treasury, which is already consecrated, right? Any money that's in the temple treasury was consecrated. It was given to the temple. That's what consecrates it. Yet consecrated property can be deconsecrated only by transferring its sanctity to unconsecrated property. In other words, you can take money in the treasury and use it to buy something that will then become consecrated because the temple bought it. And at that point, the money that was used to purchase it, that money becomes deconsecrated because it was used to purchase previously unconsecrated property. But here, what we're saying is the money is from the temple treasury and it's being used to purchase incense, right? Which is already purchased and which is consecrated property. We have a contradiction. The Gemara answers that the incense was deconsecrated with this money after the money itself had been deconsecrated. And how does the treasurer of the temple appointed to this task do so? Rabbi Shimon bar Business said he brings money from the treasury and he deconsecrates it onto the building that the artisans have constructed, but which is not yet sanctified, right? So one opinion says that these artisans are the ones that make incense, but maybe they're using it to pay for incense that hasn't already been paid for. And he then brings the incense and deconsecrates it by transferring its sanctity onto the money, and the temple treasurers then give the incense to the artisans as their wages. And finally, they buy back the incense with the funds from the new collection as is taught in the Mishnah. And so let me just review the note here. There are several opinions with regard to the method of deconsecrating. Or the word used in the Koran here is desacralization. Same idea, to deconsecrate, to remove the holiness from something. According to Rashi, the temple treasurers took money from the collection of the chamber and they legally transferred it to the artisans as wages, which caused the money to lose its sanctified status. The leftover incense would then be deconsecrated by exchanging it for that money. In other words, you make the artisans buy with their own money the leftover incense, right? That leftover incense that didn't get used. And that makes that incense, the leftover incense, now becomes the property of the artisans. Subsequently, the treasurers would buy back the incense from the artisans with money from the shekels of the new year. This money would thus be deconsecrated and was subsequently actually paid to the artisans as their wages. Very strange that you're going to use the artisans themselves as a kind of bank, as a kind of alternative to the treasury, but it's because you already have a relationship with those artisans. They're already dealing with the incense. They know how to handle it when it's given to them as payment. They're going to take care of it, and then they immediately re-exchange it. And the idea is that you pay the artisans with the old money, then you buy back as their wage, then they use that money to buy the incense. Now they own the incense, and now you buy back the incense with money from the new collection of this year. Okay, I'm going to skip that. All right. Explain this. Okay. All right. So they're also talking about what they do with certain portions of the funds in the treasury, right? There's the leftover funds, there's leftover incense, there's leftover after they purchased offerings, and there are also offerings that are left over. Like there's a leftover incense, there can also be leftover animals that were purchased by the temple, but then for one reason or another, they didn't bring them. So what do they do with that? And it's a dispute about which two Amoraim disagreed. If one prepared incense in a non-sacred vessel, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said it is disqualified for use in the temple. So they're going to talk about how they're going to allot some of these funds. And in order to reach that answer, a question that comes up is the incense, when you make it, must it be made, like, is it consecrated immediately? Like as soon as you start making it, and is it necessary to prepare it, like the mortar and pestle where you're going to grind the incense? Is the vessel that you grind it in, does it have to be consecrated? Is it a holy vessel that belongs to the temple? Or if you make, if you just grind it at the artisan's house in a vessel that belongs to him, is that incense still going to be qualified for use? And the sages disagree about that. So Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, if you prepare the incense in a non-holy vessel, a non-sacred vessel, the incense is immediately disqualified. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said it is valid. According to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, all incense is sacred on the level of a sacred vessel. Consequently, the money exchanged for it will have the same level of sanctity, and it can be used to purchase these sacred vessels, this extra money that you get from purchasing extra incense, leftover incense. However, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, it is possible to have prepared incense that has not been placed into a sacred vessel. Therefore, the money exchanged for such incense may not be used to purchase sanctified vessels, as it does not have the appropriate level of sanctity. Now, what is the source for the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, who says that the incense must be prepared in sacred vessels? He says, Exodus 30:37. The verse states about the incense, it is holy. This teaches that its creation, i.e. its preparation, must take place in a sacred vessel so that it has an elevated sanctified status from its inception. What is the source of the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi? It is holy, meaning that it must come from the collection of the temple treasury chamber, i.e. from the public and not from an individual. However, once it is purchased from communal funds, it may be prepared even in a non-sacred vessel. In other words, the communal funds have to purchase the raw materials for the incense. Now it belongs to the temple, but it doesn't necessarily have to be ground up in a sacred vessel that belongs to the temple, according to Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Boone, said, the opinion of Rabbi Yossi ben Hanina goes in accordance with Shmuel, and the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan. As we learned in a Mishnah that is coming up soon and on the next page here that we'll cover on Sunday night, there is, God willing, there is a Tanaitic, a dispute of the earlier sages concerning one who consecrates all of his possessions, and among them there are items that are suitable for use as communal offerings. Rabbi Yochanan identified the possession in the Mishnah as incense. In other words, apparently he maintained that it is possible for one to be in possession of incense that has not yet been consecrated, right? You could make this incense outside the temple and then sell the finished incense to the temple. Therefore, he must also maintain that incense that was prepared in a non-sacred vessel is valid for use in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Rabbi Hoshaya said the Mishnah should be explained as referring specifically to an artisan of the house of Avtinas. This was the house, the family house of the people who made the incense on behalf of the temple. And he would receive incense as his wages, as we've seen that this becomes part of the mechanism. At a certain moment, you might actually receive incense as your wages, which is a benefit to the temple because it's leftover incense from the year before, and now it needs to be deconsecrated so that it could be repurchased by the funds of the current year. So if you're in the process of doing that ritual with the temple, you're one of the artisans who makes the incense, You get paid. You buy last year's incense from the temple. The money goes into the temple. It's consecrated. The incense becomes deconsecrated because you bought it. And then you're going to sell it back to the temple in exchange for this year's funds. But before that last exchange happens, maybe the person dies, right? And so they find in his estate this incense, which is not sacred. So at that point, it must be that incense can exist in a deconsecrated state and not be disqualified, because then the temple's going to buy it back from the estate, in this case, or from the artisan if he's still alive, and then it's going to be valid incense for use in the temple. Hold on. Yes, and in the opinion of Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina, is in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel, as Rav Huna said in the name of Shmuel, with regard to the mortar within which they crush the ingredients of the incense, the sages considered it like a sacred vessel with regard to its ability to bestow an elevated consecrated status upon its contents. Apparently, Shmuel holds that the incense must be prepared in a sacred vessel and stored in a sacred vessel, right? Because the incense itself, and you see this in the prayer book, it even talks about, it's not just in the Yom Kippur Machzor, it's in the daily prayers when it talks about the incense, and that when they ground it, there was somebody chanting in the ear of the one preparing the incense, grind it fine, grind it fine. There's like a whole mystical atmosphere around the making of the incense, and that it should be done in sacred vessels because we want everything about it to be elevated. The incense itself serves to kind of, elevate the hopes and wishes and prayers and aspirations of the nations in a visible, tangible, up way, right? It was a beautiful, beautiful smell, and its smoke was visible, and the whole nation's, spirit is going up toward heaven with it. And so of course it should be kept, it should be manufactured and maintained in the highest state of holiness. And that's what Shmuel is saying. And Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Boone, said, and I'm almost done, so get your comments and questions in. Rabbi Yosei, the son of Rabbi Boone, said, Rabbi Huna said, this law of Shmuel, he stated it in the presence of Rabbi Yosei, and asked, may an item that was sanctified in a sacred vessel be redeemed? Since placing an item in a sacred vessel elevates its sanctity, ordinarily it would not be possible to transfer its sanctity onto money, right? And so ordinarily it shouldn't be possible to take incense that was made for the temple, that belonged to the temple, and then buy it with money, right? That now the money is going to become consecrated, and the incense, which is now going to belong to the individual rather than to the temple, would be deconsecrated. But according to Shmuel and what's being asked of Rabbi Yosei, but something that holy, that was kept at that intense high level of holiness, how can you deconsecrate that? You can't deconsecrate that. So how does this whole exchange work? It shouldn't work. And Shmuel said, this is a leniency with regard to leftover communal offerings, including incense. They can, in fact, be deconsecrated despite their elevated level of sanctity. And the bottom line is, they needed to be able to deconsecrate it so that it wouldn't be thrown out, and so that it could still be used. And the same is true of animal offerings that were not used and then the year passed. And that, usually when an animal offering becomes disqualified, what they would do is put it out to graze, wait until it develops some kind of a disqualifying blemish, then they could sell it for money, and that money, which is then consecrated, would be used to purchase a substitute offering, which would then have to be offered. So normally you would never, sell an animal that was set aside to be an offering until it becomes blemished. But there was a special leniency for the temple where animals that were disqualified because their time had passed, meaning that they were purchased with last year's funds and they didn't get offered last year. There's nothing wrong with them. So they would go through the same process as the incense. They were allowed to be purchased by somebody else. That money would become consecrated. The animal would become basically temporarily deconsecrated, and then the temple would purchase it back with money from this year's collection of shekels. And they would do the same thing with the incense. And it makes sense. I mean, you have something of tremendous holiness, and there's nothing wrong with it except that it was purchased with last year's funds, and they don't want it waste, and they don't want to lower its sanctity. So it's really just a legal mechanism which is going to allow it to continue in its destiny to be offered up in the temple, even though it's the following year rather than the previous year. I hope that was as clear. I hope that was clear. I made it as clear as I could. Okay. Questions and comments here on Shekalim 11. Tom Beck. If there were only 9 red heifers, how could the ashes have lasted that long? Answer from Pedro Fotografo. The ashes of the red heifer can last for a very long time, since only a very small amount was needed to be mixed with the purifying waters. So the fact that only 9 were ever used for purification purposes does not mean that only 9 were ever born, just that only 9 were needed or used thus far. Yeah, I mean, the fact is absolutely they could last for centuries. Ashes don't spoil, after all, as long as they could be stored in a sealed way. And just as Pedro said, you only need a little bit of the ash mixed with the waters of purification. I'm not sure that there were more red heifers that were born and they just didn't need them. My impression has always been that there's almost like a give and take between God and the Jewish people on this, that when they needed one would appear, right? And now it's been 2,000 years since the temple was destroyed, so we haven't needed a red heifer in all this time. But as we get later and later in history, and God willing, closer and closer to the times of the redemption, that the Mashiach will come, and the third temple will be rebuilt. So at that time, we're going to need those waters of purification. The ashes have not been in storage, as far as I know, for 2,000 years. So if people are going to be purified of their tumah, and we're all assumed to be in a constant state of tumah, none of us have been purified. We've walked over graves. We haven't had the waters of purification available. Even if we immersed in a mikvah, we haven't completed our purification process. So we're going to need a red heifer before the third temple comes. And so, this is kind of a trope that's used in movies about this subject from time to time. And there's this idea that we're waiting for the red heifer, and that it's going to be one of those signals that is going to signal that, the third temple, the time of the redemption and the creation of the third temple are near. Bell, where did the priests get independent income that was not consecrated temple monies? And the answer is, the priests were not full-time priests. They all had jobs the rest of the year. They were part of the Levite tribe, which didn't get a portion in the land of Israel, but were highly respected. They received tithes, first of all, from the rest of the people, and they usually, used their tithes in business. They were entrepreneurial. They lived in the cities. They were, often part of the merchant class. Often they were just very wealthy and wealthy for generations. And that allowed them, they gave them the time to study Torah, which they needed to do a lot so that they could serve effectively during their 2 weeks a year that they served in the temple. There were shifts of them, and there were sort of 26 groups who would, a group of priests would serve together for a week, and then they wouldn't be on again for another 6 months. So they had plenty of time to make a living in between, assisted by the tithes that they received because of their priestly status. Jennifer, so is it a kind of money laundering, incense laundering? I mean, money laundering suggests something underhanded. This was, obviously fully open. Everyone was aware of what was going on and why it was happening. But it is, in a sense, going through a mechanism to make sure that the main law that all this rigmarole allows us to observe is that all the offerings of this year need to be purchased with the half shekels of this year. Leftover money from a previous year could be used for other things like temple maintenance or maintenance in Jerusalem, because there were so many pilgrims coming to the temple during the 3 festivals a year. But the offerings, incense and animal offerings, the wine libations, including flour, wine, oil, water, etc., all of that had to be paid for from this year's shekels. That was just part of the law. Tom, can't the temple purchase items and then sanctify them. When the temple purchases an item, it's automatically sanctified. Any property of the temple is consecrated automatically. Jennifer, so, wait, that was the same question? Okay, and Sharon, I have been told, can't remember from whom, that one of the functions of the incense was to counter the odors that were created by the animal slaughter associated with sacrifices. Is there any validity to that? I mean, first of all, I bet that it did that, right? They said that the smell of the incense was so beautiful, and if they would have added honey to it, it would have been irresistible. But the Torah specifically says no honey will be brought on the altar. And so it's just that one ingredient short of being so sweet and like beautiful that it would put you in a trance, right? So it definitely had that power. However, I wouldn't say that it was there for the purpose of covering up those smells. Maybe God had that foresight that it would do that. But, you know, the incense was offered and used according to the commandment in the Torah that you shall bring the incense. I mean, in the incense, it's described in the Torah and what the ingredients are, etc. How they're specifically created, I mean, that was like a knowledge that was passed down through the generations. But that's a beautiful observation. It's the sort of thing that God does for us all the time. Like they didn't realize when they were out in the desert that there would be a building where over the centuries maybe an odor would build up if it wasn't washed out properly, or when there were huge numbers of people coming for the pilgrimage festivals and there was so much slaughtering going on, that the incense would be useful in that way. But God prepares the solution before we are aware of the problem. So maybe that's another instance of that principle, just as we saw at the waters of Marah, the waters of bitterness, when the children of Israel got there and they were thirsting for water in the desert. And there was a beautiful oasis with beautiful transparent water that couldn't be drunk because it tasted so bad. And right, for centuries, generations of people had come to that oasis and can't drink that water no matter how thirsty they are. But when the children of Israel arrived there, God said to Moses, that branch right there from the tree, just throw it in the water, and it instantly became sweet. Nobody knew to do that before, but the solution to the problem was there all along. And it's a nice metaphor whenever that happens in our lives, right? That we have a seemingly intractable problem, and so often the solution was there all along, right before our eyes, but we didn't see it until we were ready. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. We should all be blessed with a beautiful, joyful, healthy, inspiring, and rejuvenating Shabbos. And coinciding, at the same time, Seventh Day Passover, which begins tonight, is a festival in itself. We celebrate the crossing of the children of Israel of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, the Reed Sea. And then Eighth Day Passover is also a full-fledged holiday outside of Israel. So there will not be an AT Daily Saturday night. We'll resume Sunday night. Right now we're one page behind, so Sunday night we would be 2 pages behind, and I got to do some double shows or maybe even a triple show as soon as it makes sense for the text. Have a great night, good Shabbos, and good Yom Tov.